as well. Okay, so I just wanted to say that my task tonight is really, really simple. Because all I've got to do is introduce these great speakers. They'll say really provocative things, and you'll respond by asking questions. That's how it works. Okay? They've got to say provocative things, and you've got to ask questions. Okay? Have I made it clear that you're going to ask some questions?
No, say it again, Tony. I didn't quite understand.
You're really nice at the end if you ask some questions of these provocative speakers. Okay, so just to put some background on it, Shape got involved in this project because Bridget Telfer, who is here in the middle, suggested to me that they'd found some really interesting images that they didn't know very much about in their collection. And I'm not going to say too much about it because Bridget's going to say that. And she said that she thought Shape might be interested. And I thought, ooh, Royal College of Physicians, they're a bit posh. And they're doctors. And we work to the medical model of disability. And we have mixed views as disabled people about the medical profession. So is that a reason for not being involved? Or is that for a reason for really being involved and getting hold of it and getting into a dialogue and into an interesting discussion? And I'm so glad that we did, because I think we've had a fantastic partnership and lots of interesting things have come out of this exhibition. And one of the things we talked about doing was getting some disabled people together to discuss and dialogue these images. And that's why Sophie Partridge is here. And this is Sophie Partridge here. And she was a focus group participant, one of 27 people who work in the creative and cultural industries. And they're very opinionated, actually. And saying fantastic things about these images that they were looking at and talking to each other about, and some really rich dialogue and some really rich ideas came out of thrusting those 27 people together. And I've talked about Bridget Telfer. She's from the Royal College of Physicians. She curated this exhibition. And I've talked about Sophie as being part of the focus group. I've not talked about Professor John Howard, who's on the end, and he's the Professor of American Studies from King's College, London. And he's going to open the batting for us tonight. I was going to say one other thing, but I'm not sure I'm allowed to say it. So I'm just going to whisper in Bridget's ear.
I love you, Bridget, marry me.
Okay, I can say something about the fact that this exhibition has been nominated for a national award. Nominated. And we'll tell you more about that when we can officially tell you. I think it's a bit of a secret, so keep it to yourselves. But don't be surprised when you see that it's been nominated for a national award. And if we win, that would be great, won't it? Fantastic. We could have a party. Yeah, why not? Yes, we probably will have a party. Probably at the Royal College of Physicians. They do better canapes. And they have slightly better vintage of wine than we do. And without further ado, let me introduce Professor John Howard to talk to you. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Well, it's a real honour to be here. I'm absolutely delighted. I'm extraordinarily impressed with the exhibition that's been on display here. And I'm delighted, as clearly everyone else is, that it's getting the proper kind of recognition that it deserves. The first provocative thing I'm going to say, you've set a high bar for us, Tony. The first provocative thing I'm going to say is that the remote?
Just
right.
I have the remotest idea.
Great. Well, it's especially nice for me to be here because I'm meeting new friends and lots of old ones, former students of mine at King's College London, and sadly they're going to hear the same kinds of ideas I've been banging on about for years. But Kirsty was very nice to invite me to say just a few words as a sort of context for tonight's discussion around categories of difference, essentially the way in which we human beings imagine ourselves as either similar or quite different from one another. It's that basic, really. And I just wanted to start first with kind of three historical moments, three historical movements, really. And they are, first, that moment right after the Second World War, that, remembering the horror of the Holocaust, remembering the kind of unprecedented level of the targeting and killing of civilian populations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this new promise that we all thought might happen around a kind of post-war humanism and universalism. This idea, this moment stressed the sameness of all human beings. We really are all alike, we are one. We must make sure together that this atrocity, these kinds of atrocities, never happen again. Then we began to move into a moment, 50s, 60s, 70s, where there was just one after another, these incredible series of movements for social change, and the rise of a very particular kind of politics, often grassroots in nature, often very localized, that proceeded from an assumption about identity. Certain aspects of my character inform my politics. Certain aspects of my being inform my politics. And that became known as identity politics. And it really stressed some of the fundamental differences between human beings. And then thirdly, an era that I would say we're still in now to some extent. I'd be curious to know what you think. This idea of multiculturalism and the way in which it is very much celebrated. So we hear a lot about the celebration of difference, and especially difference as the most fundamental sort of similarity that we share. But I'll say more about that shortly. But first, you'll know very, very well what post-war humanism and universalism was about. There was this sense that we needed a kind of international authority. We needed all nations to get together in this new body called the United Nations. And we decided we'd even get, the world of finance sorted out through these big governing bodies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But of course there was a problem right there from the earliest days. Nearly 1/4 of the human population was not represented in many of these bodies, namely the People's Republic of China. But there was a great optimism in this period, and so the UN brought together a group of noted scientists who issued in 1948 a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sorry, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. There was a need, this desire to bring together scientists to speak about race was there right from the beginning. But more than that, and before that, in 1948, there was a sense that we had to actually make a statement, a kind of constitution almost, a sort of world constitution, stating that we all human beings, and this is in the very first sentence, are part of the same human family. And I think that particular choice of metaphor is quite interesting. And then they proceeded to set out a kind of Bill of Rights for all humans across the earth. That was followed very shortly thereafter in 1950 by the UNESCO Statement on Race, where scientists argued essentially that there is no fundamental scientific basis for the concept of race. Now that doesn't mean obviously that race as it's lived day to day in culture and society doesn't greatly advantage some people and greatly disadvantage others. It does, but as a kind of essence, as a kind of scientific reality, scientists began to say no, there's really nothing in that. And then there was this extraordinary phenomenon called the Family of Man exhibition. Does anyone know this? Yes? A few of us from King's College London. The Family of Man exhibition, with no modesty, declared itself as the greatest photographic exhibition of all time. 503 pictures from 68 countries curated by Edward Steichen for the Museum of Modern Arts, right? So it's a New York-based institution. It is an individual from Luxembourg relocated to the United States, quite famous photographer Edward Steichen, who is indeed putting on the largest exhibition of all time because it tours to any number of countries, and quite literally millions of people see it. And it too is arguing this really optimistic post-war notion. We are all the same, we're all one. And he used a cycle of life theme. So, you know, the idea that all of us go through something similar at birth, we all grow up, we all date, there's a section on dancing, we all get married, it seems to assert. And here, in this incredible spread, you get the kind of mapping of a middle-class American sensibility, you know, man and wife, onto the entire earth. If you had looked at marriage rituals across varied countries in the 1950s, they'd be quite divergent, right? There was polygamy practiced in any number of places. There was even the early rumblings of same-sex marriage, right? But this is what Edward Steichen said marriage looks like. It is the same for everyone across the world. Well, obviously, there was, and you'll see that at the very end of the exhibition, you know, you have the little boy leading the little girl into the bright new future. So you're really getting this notion of kind of coupling, kind of heterosexual coupling as the way we all do it, right? It's a universal, how similar we all are. Well, that led to arguments for change and arguments about difference, right? So then we saw in the 50s and increasingly in the 1960s these extraordinary movements for social change and the rise of identity politics. You'll know very well about a variety of black freedom struggles, African American civil rights movement in the States, similar movements here in the UK, and in particular post-colonial struggles throughout much of the empire and former empires of various European powers. There was LGBT organizing, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights organizing from the earliest days of the 50s and 60s, though many of us know about 1969's Stonewall riots. Some think about that as the pivotal moment or the emblematic moment in queer organizing. Disabilities rights movements were enjoying a new kind of visibility, a new sort of agency. And of course, then by the 80s, there was HIV/AIDS activism. Some of it quite powerful, enabling stridence, rightly so. But I want to show how many of these organizations owed some of their chief debts to second-wave feminism, to ideas that were circulating among women in the late 60s and 70s. And I want to do that through just a handful of images. First, isn't it funny how some of the African American freedom struggles and some of the movements and some of the slogans actually mirrored some of this kind of Edward Steichen language, right? I am a man. I belong to the family of man. And look how very interestingly they are positioned, these black men, insisting I am a man. They're positioned against these white men with their bayonets, and these bayonets literally cut right across their shadows in this image. Right? A beautiful image, I think, by Charles Moore. Women in the civil rights movement began to suggest that there are problems in these kinds of statements. Indeed, the famous jail, no bail strategy. We'll just all go to jail. We'll just all participate in civil disobedience, and we'll just fill the jails, and that will overwhelm you administratively. Well, women had different risks in jail than men did. And one of our quite talented doctoral students at King's is looking at the ways in which women were subjected to sexualized violence as a quite explicit tool of white oppression in the American South, for example. This is an image taken very shortly after the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, and look how similar it is to this image. Oh, there we are. Look at the similarity, and further, look at the borrowing of language, upper left. We shall overcome. This is a group of disability rights activists in 1973, around the time of the passage of the Rehabilitation Act. I love the angle. It's absolutely direct, right? People coming right towards you. Access is a right, right? And the image is shot kind of low, so you're looking up just a bit, so it kind of gives a heroified sort of impression you feel. But most importantly, it's people acting, right? This is what disability rights activism seems to be about for me. And related, as a part of disability rights, there is a strain of anti-nuclear activism that argues the rights of a particular group of people, indeed what I would argue is an unprecedented class of human beings. They are known as hibakusha. They are individuals who have lived through the horrors of a nuclear bomb. Right, so in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, tens of thousands are killed instantly. Tens of thousands are killed over the next day or two. But then there are many, many more who live on and suffer lifelong consequences of exposure to radiation. This is a new class of human being called hibakusha in Japanese, but you'll also find them in southern Spain, where the United States accidentally dropped 4 hydrogen bombs in 1966. Did you know that?
Nope.
The US military has done a pretty good job of keeping that under wraps. I'm not crazy about Nicholas Nixon's images of people with HIV and AIDS from the late 80s. Many have bitterly complained that the individuals are just that, individualized, passive, suffering. There's not only no sense of agency, but there's no sense of the community around these individuals. I mean, look how this Nicholas Nixon portrait contrasts with this one by, here we go, William Klein. Do you know this image? Have you seen this one before? Right, this is a group of angry people, and they're letting their concerns be known. And indeed, there's a picture within the picture, if you notice. 2 fellows, interestingly, 1945, right after the war, just out of the Navy, are kissing, and ACT UP has reappropriated this image, and in an explicit rebuke of George Herbert Walker Bush, who famously said in the States, well, we have new taxes, read my lips, absolutely not. Well, they're saying as they're kissing, read my lips. This is a new brand of quite in-your-face sort of activism. And of course, there's the 1968 Miss America pageant, where women said, we're tired of pantyhose, and we're tired of eyeliner, and we're tired of things that cost us a lot, that are meant to make us look beautiful to men, and yet, do we in fact really need them, right? Rethinking some of the fundamental assumptions about gender, as well as sexuality and other categories. This is one of my favorite portraits. This is by a lesbian photographer called Jeb Joan E. Byron. She finds a sign in a little town called Dyke, Virginia. And she puts herself underneath it, and she does what we've seen with a lot of the best kinds of self-portraiture. She takes the picture of herself, and she reclaims what was often quite a nasty word, right? The reappropriation of language, we know, is a frequent part of movements for equality. Now, quickly, and I'll move to a close here. We are in a period that I would call a period of multiculturalism and its celebrants. And I think, frankly, there's kind of a problem with this moment. There is this sense that we honor diversity, right? And that's got to be a good thing. We celebrate it. But there has also been a kind of political correctness backlash. You know this phrase, it's used all the time in the newspaper, even to this day, and I think it's one of the most cynical, crafty uses of language I have ever heard, right? Basically, this kind of rhetorical masterstroke is used to call, so that those of us, say, who call for increased sensitivity, those of us who call for tolerance, who insist that particular groups and individuals should have the capacity for self-determination and name themselves. Those kinds of calls, in an incredible reversal, are recast as intolerance, right? Urging people to be more sensitive and tolerant is recast as intolerance. We're accused of a kind of draconian policing of free speech or free thought. Why can't I just say whatever I want, no matter how racist, no matter how offensive it is? You're hurting my right to free speech. I distrust those kinds of assertions. Are we really in a post-racial age? Do we really believe that race no longer matters in hiring decisions, for example? Are we in a post-feminist age? Do we really believe that women have achieved parity? Strangely, in this era of multiculturalism, there is a defense of difference as all that we have in common. It's a kind of connective tissue, the argument goes, right? That links us all together as individuals. Of course we're all different. We all have different fingerprints, you know, the myth of fingerprints. Everything about us all is different as individuals. But what this does, this kind of argument of difference as the fundamental similarity, what that does is erases the particularity of differences, right? And the distinctive sorts of discriminations that some of us are subjected to as a result of our difference. Now, the caricature, those who scream against political correctness, the caricature of identity politics looks like this. It's an interest group politics. It's kind of like the pro-gun lobby or the automotive lobby, right? It's very self-serving, self-interested. It argues special rights, not equal rights. You hear that one a lot, right? It will result in undue minority influence. It's narrow, ignoring the common good. And really, these are often really private concerns, best left out of the public sphere. Well, I want to argue that there's still a lot of good mileage in identity politics, and especially if we get back to some of the fundamental feminist roots of what could be a better identity politics. First and foremost, the personal is always political. This line between personal space and public space, it's very blurry, right? And certainly something as seemingly private and intimate as sexuality, for example, is something that we've been legislating about for centuries. It's utterly public. And what I especially like about this notion of the personal as political, and what you see in the narratives on the walls that accompany many of the portraits, many of Lynn Wheatley's portraits, is this sense that I must speak. I speak as someone who doesn't quite fit in with these big narratives of saying these big universal narratives. And speaking my own story will demonstrate that. So for example, I might, and this was very common from the 60s, 40s, I might say, I am white, I am male, and that gets me a lot of unearned privilege in this world, right? That gets me, that opens doors for me, that lets me move in ways that many others don't. But I might also say, I'm left-handed, actually I'm right-handed, which 100 years ago was an amazing privilege, because if you were left-handed 100 years ago, you could be severely punished. I'm HIV positive, and I am temporarily able-bodied, right? None of us is permanently able-bodied, that's for certain. What I like about better strains of identity politics is that it emphasizes agency, it amplifies voice, just as these focus group participants have so explicitly stated, articulated their reactions to these sometimes painful portraits on the wall. And I think a good identity politics always points out how some of these universal claims are actually quite particular, and they're masquerading as something universal. All rights claims are positioned, and we have to focus on the way in which, though we have differences, there are different kinds of differences. And we don't have to make that a hierarchy, right? We don't have to say your oppression is worse than mine is worse than yours. But we do have to distinguish between privilege, often unearned, and marginalization that comes from belonging to particular sorts of groups. Those bring different kinds of challenges. And therefore, all of these different sets of cultural groups and identity groups I've mentioned have different, but often complementary, political agendas, and therefore, obviously, they need different representation strategies. So I'll just close with an image I quite like, actually, by a painter and a photographer, Chuck Close, but Chuck Close, like the work of Lynn Wheatley and of Sophie and many others, demonstrate what I think of as the kind of best sort of art practice, which enables the artist, the subject, and the spectator to take control, to direct representation, and to empower. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. That's a great start. I looked at that photograph too. We've got our own photograph, which is a place in Sussex, I think, called Crips Corner. It's all cripples in the audience. Has a nice residence, so Crips Corner. And I was thinking about celebrating difference. And of course, in the disability movement, when we drew together in those first and early days of the disability movement, we talked about celebrating our difference with pride. So it's fantastic. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Before we go to questions, we're going to move through our speakers, and Sophie Partridge is going to be next up. As said, when I did the introduction, Sophie was part of the 27 people who are part of this focus group. What I didn't say is Sophie's an actress, or an actor, and a writer, and she's also part of that Grey Eye Theatre Associates Artists group. And for those of you that know Grey Eye Theatre, they've been working around issues, around disability issues and with disabled actors for probably at least 30 years. So, good strong background. Thank you very much. Sophie.
Hello everybody. Well, I'll just start with a bit of spiel about myself, just to go over what Tony just said. So I am an actor and a writer. We trained professionally with Grey Eye Theatre Company in 1999 and have since gone on to perform in several productions with Grey Eye, such as the award-winning production of Peony. I've also worked with various other theatre companies, including the David Glass Ensemble, what was known as Theatre Resource in Essex, and the now demised Theatre Workshop Edinburgh, where I played Simone from the Bath in Mara Sard. My writing includes rehearsed readings of Earthbound, a contemporary telling of the Joan of Arc tale, and Fluff, my ongoing conceit. Just Me, Belle was my first commission for Grey Eye, as what was performed in schools as an interactive piece for young people in autumn '09. At the beginning of this year, I co-facilitated a series of workshops for young disabled people as part of the Develop Young Hacking Festival. And since then, I've been in receipt of an Arts Council England grant to develop my solo performance piece. You ready for this, Zane? Song of Semerswak, SEMMERSUAQ, which incorporates puppets and a soundscape. I am a rhinestone roller with Grey Eye Theatre Company, and I have a French-Canadian mum, an 83-year-old dad, 2 sisters, 1 brother, various uncles, aunts and cousins, great friends, good personal assistants, and none of these would I be without. So, tonight's theme. Kirsty asked me to speak about public bodies, disability on display. Now, myself as someone with a very visible impairment, I do feel I'm always displayed, and this was also echoed by Karen Sutherland, one of the focus group participants. Display itself is not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think. I'd certainly rather that than being shut away somewhere, hidden from view. The quest for me always is to gain as much control as possible over how I'm displayed. Now, whether that's simply by my choice of clothes as I trundle up the street, portrayal of myself as a disabled person in the press and media, or a photo, or on stage, etc. It's a bit like being famous without the red carpet and the work. For some of the original exhibitors in the Royal College of Physicians collection, there were, I think, varying degrees of fame, or notoriety at least. Blind Granny, for example. They too had adopted that attitude: if we're going to be looked at anyway, we may as well get paid for it. And as much as I'd like to take credit for that line, it's actually a quote from Kate O'Reilly's stage play, the aforementioned Peeling. Now, the premise of Peeling being that 3 disabled women are stuck at the back in the chorus of a postmodern and ironic production of the Trojan women. The character I played, called Coral even, waxed lyrical about her body, about being observed because of her body, and yet, at the same time, being an observer of the actual observation process. So just to quote a few lines that Coral says, she says, "I watch them, the audience, their heads sleek in the dark, with their little quirks, coughs, nervous tics, etc. I watch them and I wonder, what do you think of me?" As individuals, particularly perhaps as women, who are constantly subjected to a barrage of images in the media of how we should look and how our body should be, are no different than most people, in that there are bits of me that I like more than others. Last winter, I threw caution to the wind, along with my clothes, and put very nearly all of me on display when I took part in a burlesque performance. I performed with other visibly disabled women at Dada Fest in Liverpool. We almost literally froze all our bits off per display. And I did it for free. My choice and within my control. What would it have become, I wonder, if it had been for money? To return to the historical portraits in the exhibition, it seems each individual was selling their uniqueness, their best feature, in fact, being the curves in unusual places. They were regarded as freaks, and we could debate endlessly here tonight whether contemporary disabled people, such as myself, are revered as such today. Are Paralympians, in fact, just super crips? Now, as Nick Scarlett, another of the focus group participants, commented, these individuals with impairments perform physical feats to prove their worth in a culture based on survival of the fittest. Were the individuals featured in the original portraits the super crips of their day? Individuals who had, to a certain extent, conformed to that classic cliche of triumph over tragedy, because they had seemingly turned exploitation on its head and were able to gain an amount of respect, earning a living by exploiting the curiosity of the viewer. Having myself once played a character on stage in a piece who supposedly enshrined fear in a quasi-horror called the Unheimlich Spine,
Yay!
Set him up,
so having played that character, I don't actually think that any of the historical individuals were ever really held in fear, more admiration for looking so different, because as humans so easily jaded, we long, I think, to see something new. Last year, I was approached by a film company wanting me to audition for The Human Centipede 2. Yes, a sequel. The original film apparently being a cult classic. Whatever. Now, I've long held a theory that disabled actors can get ensnared in doing weirdy stuff, just as some non-disabled performers end up doing porn. As soon as I mentioned to the makers of said centipede that I would need the audition to be held in a wheelchair-accessible space with a loo, etc., I never heard from them again. Recently, I had an offer I personally found more flattering when I was approached to play the warrior girl in a short sci-fi film, and paid, of course. I was quite chuffed with that offer, but not flattered enough to do it for nothing, not after 12 years of professional acting. It's almost as if, and I'm sure this could almost be said of the historical traits, the non-disabled general public want the myth of disabled people's lives and not the reality, which can be quite mundane, like most people's. Last night saw the final episode in Channel 4 series Seven Dwarfs, which came to tell the real stories of the dwarves. Real stories about seven dwarfs, not an insightful yet humorous documentary about two female actors and 5 male of short stature. No, just stories about dwarfs. The sum of their impairments all lumped together, all living in a house where Snow White comes round for sleepovers. Would it have been acceptable for British television to air a programme entitled Seven Blacks, Seven Gays? Again, I wonder. I do feel strongly that what's needed is disabled writers to portray disabled characters in TV, literature, etc. Still on TV, disabled characters tend to be standy-uppies that sit down and are not very bendy-looking. Else, impairment-specific storylines are written by said standy-uppies. Very rarely do I get put up for telecastings because there's no box for me. I'm small, but I have a powered wheelchair, so I can't go in the little person casting box. But because I'm teeny tiny, I'm also outside the lines of the average wheelchair user one as well. It feels like the only time someone with a very visible impairment makes a screen debut is when the TV itself morphed into a literal goggle box with programmes like Body Shock. The modern day freak show comes right into your home, and I wouldn't put my money on the participants being the ones in control of how they're portrayed. But what if you don't look bendy? As Julie McNamara puts it, also another Focus Group participant, can you still join the disabled club if you're too symmetrical and be accepted as that by the viewing public